then you burst into fire. Forever.
Hello.
Hello.
You're listening to The Full Blossom of the Evening, a podcast about David Lynch and Twin Peaks.
I'm Indigo.
And I'm Hilary.
And listeners, we're going to tell it to you. We're going to tell it to you straight. Today, we are talking about
the films of Jacques Tati.
I saw her glowing. I saw her smiling.
So, listeners, this is the episode that we had mentioned previously that we had been working on. And obviously, with everything that happened with David's passing, we put it to the side to just spend some time talking about him and his memory. But now we are ready to bring you something lighthearted when I think we could use it almost.
This is perfect timing. This was an episode that was on our original brainstorm list way back when we were first planning this podcast. And that's because Jacques Tati was always on Lynch's very short list of his favorite directors.
Yeah, and it's so clear once you watch through Tati's filmography and then you start looking through David's work, you can see so many connections and it becomes more and more apparent. Even as you kind of bounce back and forth, you're like, wait, that's that. And oh, then this is so this.
In 1990, in an interview with the French magazine Positif, Lynch said, quote, "On one hand, I was very ignorant about movies, and on the other hand, what I liked were films like Sunset Boulevard, Rear Window, or the work of Jacques Tati." There he is. And Lynch says, "And I watched them during the shooting of Eraserhead."
I also love Rear Window, and I feel like that's another one that makes a lot of sense with Twin Peaks, honestly, because it's very much all these everyday people trying to jump in and being like, I could solve a crime, and then maybe things don't go quite as they planned.
But the neat thing about Lynch mentioning this, that he watched it during the filming of Eraserhead, is that Tati could have influenced all of Lynch's work.
Oh, yeah, because it's right there from the beginning with Eraserhead. Like, it is earnest and playful in a way that I think that's something we hear a lot with David. Like, a commentary on his work often is that he's very good at balancing that. There's a lot of intense themes going on in a lot of his works, but he does a really good job of balancing that with moments of lightheartedness and laughter, moments of humor, and that sort of eases it a bit.
Well, in a 1999 interview with Salon.com, Lynch admitted that he didn't see many contemporary films, but he said, "There are films I would see every other day if I had the time. I want to dream when I see a film." And of the 8 films he listed, 2 were by Jacques Tati. They were Monsieur Hulot's Holiday and Mon Oncle. Another one was Lolita, which we discussed in our first episode.
Yeah, and also the more we looked into Tati, it just made so much more sense about the connection between them because they have very similar approaches to filmmaking in the ways that they're so dedicated to their craft and their vision. No matter what the cost is, even if it bankrupts them, they just want to make sure that everything is exactly how they imagined it. Whether that means making your own props or your own sound effects or whatever you have to do just to get that vision from your brain onto the screen.
The first thing that jumped up to me as a similarity between them was just the comparable artistry between the two of them, between Lynch and Tati. And when I started reading more articles and watching more interviews with Tati, I started to think, wow, these men are kindred spirits. There was one anecdote in particular that inspired that thought for me. It was an interview with Andre Bazin, where Tati said, quote, "Above all, I love to whistle, and I think that the day I will no longer be able to whistle in the street, that will be a very sad day indeed. They may look stupid, but I like people who whistle in the street. Sometimes when I get out of the editing room, I whistle, and, I believe that has great importance." And I thought, I can imagine David Lynch saying something like that.
Yeah.
And so here I am thinking that I'm so insightful, like, kindred spirits. And then I found an interview from 1982. Lynch was interviewed by Jonathan Rosenbaum, and Lynch just confirmed it. He said, quote, "I feel like in a way he's a kindred soul. That guy's so creative, it's unbelievable. I think he's one of the all-time greats." And I mean, how often does David Lynch himself confirm a fan's hunches? Right?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of stuff that comes up with David Lynch or like Twin Peaks is speculation. Like on our past episodes, when we see a connection, we will often say, we don't have an exact interview or something where he said this. Sometimes we do, but not always. So that one was a nice one to get that confirmation. So the way we intend to structure this episode is, first, we're just going to give a brief bio of Tati. We'll talk a little bit about our experiences with these films because neither of us had seen any Jacques Tati films before starting this project.
After the bio and our personal responses, we're going to move into doing some broad parallels between Tati and Lynch. And then we're going to end with some fun specific details that we think Lynch incorporated into his films as allusions or homages to Tati.
So I'm going to start off. Jacques Tati was born Jacques Tadishev in 1907 in France, a descendant of Russian nobility. He was destined for a career in the family business of picture framing. His grandfather's framing customers included Van Gogh and Toulouse-Lautrec, but instead he abandoned his apprenticeship and his bourgeoisie family comforts and joined up with the bohemians and artists in Paris.
Well, Tati was a skilled athlete, and in Paris he developed this vaudeville mime act, incorporating sports like tennis, fishing, and horseback riding. And he had some trouble getting the act going at first because it was so weird. It was not like anything anybody had seen before. So lots of impresarios were hesitant to book him. Anyway, he gets his big break in 1934. A friend arranges for him to appear on a program at the Ritz, and Tati was so scared. This story is really charming. It was told in 1957 to Lillian Ross of The New Yorker. Tati said, quote, "I was so frightened that though I was supposed to go on first, I couldn't stand or talk. I hid in a corner backstage, and the show started without me. When it was over and the people were leaving, the manager of the show saw me hiding in the corner. He ran out on the stage and shouted that one of the entertainers had been forgotten. Then he introduced me. The people returned to their seats, and I had to go on. The next thing I knew, I heard them laughing. I could not imagine that they were laughing at me. I looked around for the entertainer they were laughing at. No one else was on the stage. It had to be me." What a beautiful moment. That's how he began.
I know. And I mean, I feel like it's so apparent in his work because he really does lean so much on the physical comedy. So it makes a lot of sense that his background kind of started in that way. It's most of his stuff, there are very funny things happening to him or things like him like tripping or making mistakes. And it really fits in with that mime humor where you are completely relying on your body and not on what you're saying.
Definitely. Now, those actual vaudeville acts that he created, I think they were called like sporting impressions. He recreated a little bit of that in Monsieur Hulot's Holiday with the tennis match.
Yeah.
And the ping pong, he's playing ping pong. But in his last film, Parade, he actually does those acts again. So we can still see them.
Which is so lucky. So then he shortened his family name at this point in order to fit on the marquee of the theater. The act was just such a huge hit. In 1936, the writer Colette saw him and wrote of Tati in her review, "He has the suggestive power of all great artists." He carried a copy of that review with him everywhere.
Tati's first child, Helga Marie Jeanne Schiele, was born in 1942. Her mother, Herta Schiele, was a fellow performer, and when Tati abandoned them both, supposedly under intense pressure from his sister, the theater community cast him out.
It was really heartbreaking seeing that when we were doing our research. It was just such an unfortunate circumstance, I think.
We were both very glad, though, that this theater community supported Helga and her mother.
Yeah, I mean, for actually stepping up and supporting her during a situation like that, I think it's normally the other way around. It usually gets buried. So at least there was that.
After that, Tati went on to act in films by other directors and began making his own in 1946 with the short film The School for Postmen. The main character, Francois the Postman, played by Tati himself, went on to be featured in his first full-length film, Jour de Fête, in 1949.
And then, in his next feature film, Monsieur Hulot's Holiday, in 1953, Tati created his most famous character, Monsieur Hulot. Tati went on to play Hulot in 3 more films, Mon Oncle in 1958, and then Playtime in 1967, and then finally in Traffic in 1971.
Playtime is regarded as Tati's masterpiece, and it's my favorite. But it bankrupted him and his production company. He lost his family home and the rights to his films in the aftermath. Traffic was a much more conventional film, and Tati said he should have made it before Playtime, not after. He said Playtime should have been his last film. His actual last film, Parade, was made for Swedish television in 1974.
And then Tati passed away in 1982. 2 of his children, Sophie and Pierre Tatashev, were rightly afraid that their father's legacy as one of the greats of French cinema would be lost. They tracked down and reacquired the rights to his films, and then Sophie herself, a director and film editor, meticulously restored Jour de Fête. She eventually established Les Films de Mon Oncle to oversee the restoration, preservation, and circulation of Tati's work after her death in 2001.
Now, there's another film, the animated film The Illusionist by Sylvain Chomet, is based on a screenplay by Jacques Tati. One of Tati's surviving grandchildren, Richard MacDonald, wrote an impassioned public letter denouncing this film, declaring it to be an insult to Tati's intent and urging people not to see it. That letter successfully persuaded Indigo and I not to watch it. But you can read that letter on RogerEbert.com. It's titled The Secret of Jacques Tati.
Yeah.
So, since neither of us had any experience with Jacques Tati before we started preparing for this, I watched the films in order. I watched them chronologically. You didn't do that.
No. So I started with Mon Oncle because I think that might have been the one that you suggested that you were talking about a lot because you had started watching them before I did. And you said I should really start with like that one. And then I went from that to Playtime. And then the final one that I watched before this recording was Jour de Fête. And it's very interesting watching them out of order because so I got this introduction to his later work, this Monsieur Hulot work, where he really relies more on exterior sounds. There's not a lot of dialogue, and the sound becomes such a big part of that the dialogue just fizzles out, or it's just chatter background kind of sound. But in Jour de Fête, that is a very chatty film. There is so much more dialogue, and it's really just like a regular movie, I would say, and it's still so good, and it's a great example of his comedy. like there are so many scenes where I was just busting out laughing. I love that there is this montage because he's this French postman that is trying to keep up with the like standards of the American style postman, and it's so funny. He's on this mission now to like deliver as quickly as he can all of these letters, and all of the people that he's running into are in the middle of things. Like they're in the middle of doing their work and their daily tasks. And so there's this hilarious montage of the way that he's trying to deliver them. So like one guy's got like a pitchfork and he's riding past him on a bike and he just like stabs it onto the pitchfork. There's some people that are busy and they're standing by a horse and they're not paying attention to him, and he just like tucks it under the horse's tail. Like there's so many really just laugh out loud funny parts.
I agree. I laughed out loud numerous times. And alone, you know.
Yeah.
I laugh out loud more easily when I'm with other people. But to laugh out loud alone at a film as often as I do with Jacques Tati, that says a lot.
Right. Like you can't breathe kind of laughing.
You know, but Jour de Fête really does introduce that satirical element that runs through all of Tati's films, where he is gently and affectionately making fun of something in French society, but in this case also American society. Yeah. He's making fun of this American drive for efficiency and hyper productivity. And so I think we enjoyed this from that point of view too.
Right. Yeah, it's totally for sure a commentary on all these modern ways and capitalism and things like that. And it was really refreshing.
We also want to laugh at those things.
Yes.
So of the films you've watched so far, which was your favorite?
I think I'm definitely torn between Mon Oncle and Playtime. There's just so many things I really loved about both. It's hard because I really enjoy them all. And a lot of them have very similar energy, of course, like especially because it's like any of the ones with Monsieur Hulot, you know, like you've got that main character who's going to be in all of them. And also just in general in this like Tati universe where there's so much playfulness and laughter and joy. They have so many similarities, but I think it would be hard to pick a top one, but if I could pick a top two, it would be Mon Oncle and Playtime, because I think they're just really going to live in my heart for a long time. And they're just visually so stunning. I remember when I was watching Playtime for the first time and talking to you about... There's this scene, listeners, there's this scene to keep an eye out for where you are looking at this apartment building and it's like you can just see into all of these different apartments. There's like these 4 apartments that you get like a view into what's happening because of these giant windows. And I loved it so much because I'm obsessed with The Mysteries of Pittsburgh by Michael Chabon, and there's this sort of theory that the characters in that book have, which is the museum of real life, like looking in the windows of strangers and just watching them live their lives. And it looks like a museum display when you're looking at them through these big windows and you're just walking by. And that scene is so much like that. It looks like you're looking at like a dollhouse or a museum display because it's so open-faced like that. And I loved that scene so much. Like I could replay that particular scene over and over again because you can just get absorbed in all of the little details. I did rewatch it. Like I rewound it and rewatched that particular little scene, I think like 3 times because I just thought it was so visually stunning and then also just like so fun. And I just really wanted to absorb and really focus on all of those details.
It is a beautiful scene.
Yeah.
And hilariously funny.
Yes, yeah. And it's so fun because you've got this like battle, like how we were just saying, it's like a battle of these like ugly, boxy new buildings versus the old France in both of them, in both films. And it's something I feel deeply. It's like, why can't we have these beautiful old things rather than these like new hyper modern condos and stuff?
One of the things I find so charming about Tati's films is this satirizing of modernism, modern architecture, modern furniture, just the whole modernist sensibility. He doesn't hate modernism, but he is definitely lampooning the drive for it, at the expense of everything else.
Right.
The whole idea that the home is a machine and that cities are going to be these efficient, clean, orderly places. You can just see the joke of that throughout Tati's work. And, we see that here too. We happen to live in a city that's old by American standards, but we both live in neighborhoods that are very close to neighborhoods that were decimated during the mid-20th century's drive for this new vision of urbanism that Tati is ridiculing. So the city center of my neighborhood was torn out, and this giant concrete mall thing was built where the center of the town was. It quickly failed, as they do.
They always do.
And for a long, long time, it was vacant and terrifying.
Yeah.
Yours, they're reconfiguring it, right? They're kind of trying to restore.
Right. And it's one of those things where it's really heartbreaking. And like, I know that it comes down to money when they're tearing down these beautiful old buildings. They're like, well, it's going to be cheaper to knock it down and build an ugly condo. But it's like, really? We couldn't just keep this charming old building with all of its beautiful stone carvings and everything? And it's reasons like that I loved Monsieur Hulot so much. Like, I feel like we could be friends. Like, we could be walking around the city, like looking at these like big modern builds and be like, ugh. And then see like all these like beautiful older houses and buildings and stuff and just be like, oh, look at that. How nice, how classic.
One thing I enjoy about Monsieur Hulot is watching him try to get comfortable in spaces that are not, they're made by humans, but not for humans.
No, they're very robotic.
And he's trying to find a way to make that couch in the Villa Arpels comfortable. He has to turn it on its side in order to make it function as a piece of furniture for a human being. Or in playtime when he's in that waiting room with the portraits of like the board of directors or something. And it's all that identical black chair with the chrome, and it makes that hilarious like squishing sound. And just his interactions with what is honestly a nice enough looking piece of furniture just makes it seem so absurd.
Right. It feels
So
like a
fun.
recalcitrant object.
Yes.
Because you're like, this chair is my enemy for some reason. And you're like, well, it is just a chair. And he's like, I think it's my enemy for some reason.
Another reason Lynch probably loved this.
Yeah.
That quote that he had about Lolita and the cot scene.
Oh my
we
gosh.
could see him saying that about Tati as well.
I mean, that scene honestly could be straight from a Jacques Tati film, because that would be totally something that would happen to Monsieur Hulot.
Well, you and I may be kind of biased because we both like living in old houses and we tend toward maximalism. But the Arpels villa in Mon Oncle is such a hoot, right? It is this showpiece of a house that doesn't even look like human beings live in it. No. Poor little Gerard, with his sad little toys and his tidy little bedroom. Even a child can't be a child in a house that looks like a dentist office.
No, I mean, it looks so cold and untouched. And I know that we both like really loved this one scene where he's in the kitchen and he's just so out of his element as he walks in. I'm a baker, and when he walks into that kitchen, I hated it so much. It's so cold and creepy. It looks like a spaceship, not a kitchen. And he goes to get this pitcher out of the cabinet. And it's this like weird bubble pitcher. And so the thing is that it falls out of his hands and it bounces back up because apparently like the bottom of it is like a ball. And so it bounces back up, he catches it, and he's kind of got this look on his face because again, it's like this kind of mime humor where it's not a lot of talking, it's just like facial stuff and like gestures. And so like he has this expression of, oh, that's kind of funny. And so he bounces it, like drops it, it bounces back up a couple times. And then he goes to do the same thing with a glass out of the cabinet.
And it shatters.
It just shatters. It just shatters. And the sound is so great. And it's so funny because it's like he's so particular about his sounds. And when you hear it, it is this like ear-splitting glass shatter that just, it like flicks that switch in your brain where you're just like, oh no.
Well, Tati's assistant said that she watched Tati break glasses for an hour and a half until he got exactly the sound he wanted in that moment.
Which is so worth it because it was perfect.
One of the many moments I love in Mon Oncle, in addition to that one, which I've probably watched 50 times, is Monsieur Hulot walking up the stairs of his apartment building.
Yeah.
It's just transfixing to me. We were talking earlier today about Richard Scarry.
Yeah.
I loved Richard Scarry books as a child because they had these big, elaborate buildings with lots of mysterious interiors. And
Busy town. It is very Jacques Tati, busy town.
Yes. But I got the same feeling that I used to have as a child watching Jacques Tati's character walk up that bizarre stairwell that involves 360-degree turns, and sometimes you see his legs and sometimes his upper body. Oh, it's so funny. The opposite of the Villa Arpels, right?
Yes.
Zero efficiency.
Yes.
Only messy, complicated humanity. It looks like it's been built onto and added onto over decades or centuries, this building, and I'm here for it.
Yeah.
Oh, and another thing I love in that film is when he goes to the plastic factory for the first time and all the little stray dogs are following him and they just go right into the factory with him. He doesn't deliberately let them in. They just follow him. He's oblivious. I just laughed out loud when all those little dogs trotted right into that super pristine, hyper-modern buzzing factory.
Well, and I remember that one thing I really loved was that the dogs were actual stray dogs that got adopted afterwards, right?
Yeah, they were just from the pound. And then after the filming was over, the producer said, oh, we better take them back to the pound. Tati was mortified. He said, they know us. You know, that they're part of us. So instead, he put ads in the newspaper and called these dogs the stars of Mon Oncle. And they had dozens and dozens of people lining up to adopt them. And they all got adopted, got happy endings.
Right. I mean, which is just so wonderful. And it's like, I'm sure that the people that did that, it was so special to them. Like, this was probably a director that they loved so much. And to be able to take a piece of that home and have it be like a new member of your family is so exciting and it's so sweet.
So now we're going to move into the areas of comparison between Tati and Lynch. And so chapter 1 will just be a general discussion of their personalities and artistic approaches, where we see similarities. David Lynch and Jacques Tati really have a lot of nice parallels. I mean, for one, they have these very sweet, childlike natures, it seems, that are also paired with absolute meticulous artistry.
Yeah, there's like a sense of whimsy and earnestness, but also, as we kind of mentioned before, there's this real attention to detail as well, and this like determination to meet that vision no matter what it takes. Like, if it is an hour and a half of breaking glass, it is. Like, I don't care how long it takes to film a scene.
I knew you were going to do that.
I know, I had to. I mean, really, there's these two artists that have this very particular vision, and they said, no, I'm going to make exactly what I'm picturing, no matter what. We are going to get what I see in my head onto the screen.
And back when we did our episode on Good Times on Our Street, we focused a lot on that sweet kind of childlike nature that comes through in David Lynch, probably in part inspired by that book that's a permanent part of his brain.
Oh, for sure.
And I think we see so much of that spirit in Tati as well. One thing about Tati is he incorporates dogs in particular a lot. He loved animals. But I did read this great story about Tati going to a restaurant with a bunch of other filmmakers, people, and somebody at another table had a dog, and he spent the whole time trying to entertain the dog and interact with the dog, and all the humans who were there to hobnob with Jacques Tati got second place.
Yeah, which, I mean, I feel like I could totally picture that being something that like David Lynch would do. Like he would totally get distracted by something whimsical or something. And like also it's just very relatable. Like I'm very much the person that I show up at a party and I'm like, do you have a pet? Where's your pet? I'd like to see the animal, please. I would like to spend time with the animal.
Tati also cast a lot of children in his films, and he clearly valued children's experience and perspective. We see the camera spend a lot of time watching children just be kids in all the films. In particular, one of my favorite moments is at the end of Monsieur Hulot's Holiday. Hulot tries to go to say goodbye to all the other adults who they've all been vacationing together at this seaside resort, and none of them are interested in talking to him anymore. So he goes and sits on the beach where the little boys are throwing sand at each other, and so he throws some sand too. It's really very, very nice.
Yeah. Well, and then I would even say that, like with Playtime, the ending is still very playful, even though it doesn't necessarily focus particularly on children, because we've got our little carousel going in the street. So it makes sense that in that case, it's the adults are just becoming childlike again. It's still this sense of childlike wonder.
Definitely. Now, we don't see a lot of children in Lynch's work, probably for the best, considering what Hollywood is like for children. But he does portray childlike adults very fondly.
Yeah. Well, and I would say that the children that he does have are often treated with a lot of agency. They definitely are respected and are, I feel like, are often portrayed as smart. Like, for example, Harriet, our namesake. She is a young girl, but she is obviously incredibly smart. You know, everyone is respecting her while she's sharing her poem. They don't play down her intelligence just because she's a child.
Definitely true. They respect her enough to give her that space. You know, that's very important. Now, little Nicky's probably the exception here, but Lynch, I don't know how involved Lynch was with the little Nicky story arc. He didn't direct those episodes. Well, another trait that Tati and Lynch shared was a stubborn independence. They both refused to compromise on their artistic integrity. Lynch said in Lynch on Lynch that, quote, compromise ruins a film, and Tati would have fully agreed with him on that.
Right. Well, and with his passing and everything, I saw a post going around that the Netflix CEO or something had put out a statement about his passing. And a lot of fans were really upset about it because he had the audacity to be like, oh, gone too soon. There were so many projects we could have done together. And everyone in the comments was just like, if you really wanted him to make something for you, you would have given him the funding to do so. But you didn't want to work with someone who had a clear vision and didn't want to compromise it. Like you could have given him that chance. You could have funded that. So don't say, oh, what a shame. How dare you?
You know, that's one of the things that Tati hated about filmmaking. He thought that it shouldn't become an industry like any other, but by mid-20th century, it was becoming that. He lamented in a 1958 interview, quote, "What troubles me is that young filmmakers today may no longer choose their story. They may no longer do what they want. These days, filmmaking has become an industry on the same level as the car industry. But cinema is not or should not be a mass-produced automobile." Tati, like Lynch, insisted on keeping full artistic control of his work. After his experience with Dune, Lynch insisted on always having final cut of his films. And similarly, Tati said, I did everything I wanted to do. If you don't like that, I am the only one to blame.
And there's a lot of integrity to that I think people respect a lot. I had kind of mentioned this in our last episode that I think one of the things people have been saying so much about David and a lot of the statements that have been coming out over the last couple weeks is that it's just how much he inspired other artists to have that commitment to their vision because of his own integrity to it. He inspired so many artists to pursue their weird work that people told them, it's not going to make you money, it's not going to whatever. And then they see David Lynch and they say, I don't think this is going to make me a millionaire. I don't know if I'll be liked, if I'll be popular. But you know what? David Lynch was probably in the same boat and made stuff anyways. If David's going to make it, then I'm just going to make it too. And I think that really pairs with Tati's energy. And I also wonder if that would have been something that inspired that in David, is like obviously being a fan of Tati, seeing that determination to make things the way that he wants to, then that could inform David's career as well. And then it's like a cycle, and then David inspires other artists to do the same. And I hope that just sort of keeps going on.
Me too. Well, another really interesting parallel between David Lynch and Jacques Tati in general is their approach to filmmaking kind of involves painting. Christine McKenna calls this story, quote, the core event of the David Lynch creation myth. The story is that in 1967, Lynch was working on a painting of a figure standing among dark green foliage, and that he sensed, quote, a little wind and saw a flicker of movement in the painting. And that idea of a moving painting came into his mind, and the filmmaker was born. And doesn't Jacques Tati have a similar approach?
Yeah, in a 1973 interview with Jonathan Rosenbaum in Film Comment, Tati described a moment in Playtime this way. He said, you'll have a very simple image with very little movement, and the sound will add a new dimension, like putting sound in a painting. Whoosh! An ominous whoosh, perhaps.
A Tati whoosh.
Yeah.
I just love, though, that Lynch is inspired by the thought of a moving painting, and Tati's inspired by the thought of this painting with sound. And both of them, when you look at the composition of the images they created in their films, they're often like paintings or photographs. I remember hearing a story about Laura Dern on the set of Twin Peaks: The Return, that a costume designer, I think, was asking her, like, how do you want to be styled? What do you want to wear here? And her response was, ask David, it's his painting. And I really like the idea that both of these filmmakers approach their work in this way as paintings.
Yeah. And also, speaking of Tati adding sound to this painting, that's our next topic of comparison.
That's our chapter 2.
That's our chapter 2, is the way that they are both obsessed with sound. Tati shot silently and then added sound afterwards because he liked to talk continuously when he directed and make the actors feel at home and playful, which you can really see. When you watch them, you can just tell that everyone's having so much fun doing it.
He didn't cast a lot of professional actors. Tati preferred to cast non-actors and kind of bring the performance out of them, as opposed to bringing in professional actors who were used to doing line readings and having a very particular approach.
Yeah, and that's something that David is known for as well. So many of the actors that have put out statements after his passing about having worked with him, they're all very much along this line of, David found me and picked me out of obscurity. I was no one, and he saw me, and he saw that I could do this. He saw that I could fit into this role. He was just so good at seeing people and seeing their potential and just knowing, like, I know exactly what to do with you.
Yeah, Tati had very much that philosophy. But to go back to sound, Tati, like Lynch, designed sounds with precision. We already talked about that glass breaking, but when I was reading about Tati, it reminded me so much of the stories about David Lynch working with Alan Splett on the set of Eraserhead and just working for countless hours to come up with the precise sounds for that film, sounds that didn't exist yet, that weren't in any catalog of sound effects. So this continued through all of Lynch's filmmaking, this attention to sound.
Well, and another assistant of Tati's, kind of like the glass thing, had described him tearing dozens of kinds of fabric until he got the perfect sound of the tear and the waiter's pants.
In playtime.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then also Madame Arpel's heel clicks were ping pong balls, and he dented one just slightly, just to give it that slightly different sound than the other one, which is another attention to detail where it's like you have this very particular sound in your head and you're like, I'm gonna figure out how to make this. Like, I might be using some really weird materials to do it, but I'm gonna create a sound that does not exist yet.
The critic John Fawell argues that Tati uses sound for character development. I just love this idea. So on those heel clicks that Indigo just mentioned, Madame Arpel's heel clicks, Fawell wrote, quote, "No amount of character development or analysis could express Madame Arpel's flightiness and manic cleanliness as well as these synced clicks do." He also described the similar clicking of the heels of Arpel's secretary, the little secretary at the factory, and he said that they, quote, "managed to perfectly convey her busy uselessness and resonate with her pride in her little duties." My favorite moment with that secretary, though, is when she hops onto the curb with both feet at the same time. Just hop.
Right. And that's like such, again, a really great moment of that physical comedy. It's like a laugh out loud moment where, and that's why these movies bear rewatching, because there's so many little things that you kind of just have to like replay, like just kind of like rewind a little bit, replay and be like, I need to see that again, because what was that? That was so funny.
They're just so subtle. If you look away for a moment, you've missed it, and you've missed a chance to just laugh out loud. The other interesting thing that Tati and Lynch do with sound is they're both really interested in atmospheric sound. Lynch was famous for being excited about what he called room tone. And if you watch a Lynch film with headphones, you've experienced those room tones. And Tati did that too. The buzzing factory in Mon Oncle, right? Every room has this distinctive buzz. And the background hum of dialogue. Tati said, "My dialogue isn't important. The dialogue is background sound as you hear it when you're on the street in Paris or New York, a brouhaha of voices."
A sound I really love, speaking kind of a room sound, is in Jour de Fête. There's this scene where he is like using the bathroom in the post office and he turns on the water and he's got it going so fast, like it's coming out so much, and then it messes with the pipes or something, so you just hear this like boom, 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 and it's like crazy. You can hear all these like pipe screeching, thumping sounds. And I actually have a friend who, their house, it's like this. If you turn on the hot water knob too far, it makes this horrible, we call it the bad sound. And we always like roast each other. Like if you come out of the bathroom and that you've made the bad sound, we're like, you know better, you know? So it was like hearing that in that scene, I was like, oh my gosh, like I can't wait to like make my friends watch this because it's this like cascade of crazy sounds, and his coworkers are just like looking up and then going back to work and then looking up again and going back to work, and it's just so ridiculous. And it felt like it could totally be like a Lynch moment or something, because those sounds were so like particularly oppressive and like mechanical kind of. And I could just picture that being something out of like Eraserhead, like apartment sounds, just like the clanking pipes and stuff.
Speaking of plumbing, I love the tortured sucking sound of that hideous fish fountain in Mon Oncle. It's so great. I love how Madame Arpel turns it on when someone buzzes in the gate. She uses this fish fountain to impress company, but when the person walks in, if she decides they're not fountain worthy, she turns it off. And the fountain just chokes and splutters and makes horrible sounds as if it's registering its disgust with this unworthy visitor.
Well, and it's funny because he really did nail it with that sound, because my cats have like a little water fountain. That is the exact sound it makes when it runs out of water and I know I need to refill it. It's just this like gluk, 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 like choking sound.
And I always think of the Eraserhead baby, the sound that it makes when it gets sick. It reminds me of that fish fountain.
Yeah, and it also kind of looks like it too.
The fish fountain looks like the baby. A little bit, yeah.
Yeah, like, and also especially there's like that part where it's like spitting up that like black oily liquid and it's so wretched. And Monsieur Hulot is so horrified. I mean, he hates that fountain. He's always kind of like trying to skirt around it, like, oh God, I don't want to get close to it. And when he looks at it, it's so funny. He's like, this is my nemesis, my terror, my tormentor.
My favorite part about the fountain is that it is a finite resource that we can only use for worthy guests. We can't just run the fountain all the time. We have to turn it on when guests we want to impress are there.
You're right. Yeah, it's like, oh, a delivery person, turn the fountain off.
Another sound we have to mention from Tati, of course, is the bonk. Bonk. Can you do it?
Bonk.
That was good. That's in Monsieur Hulot's Holiday. I hope you all know what we're talking about.
Yeah, it's the dining room doors in the hotel. They just make this really wonderful sound. It's like, I feel like it's accurate too. I feel like anytime I've ever encountered kind of swinging doors like that, like actually we have those at the cafe that I work at into the kitchen downstairs. And that kind of is the sound they make. It's just like as they open and close and they swing past each other, it's this like donk sound.
Well, what's funny about that then is that maybe that's just the sound doors make, but the way Tati uses that sound in Monsieur Hulot's Holiday makes it hilarious. Takes an ordinary thing, just the sound swinging doors make, and makes it an absolute hoot.
All right, and do you want to move on to chapter 3, place?
In addition to having similar values and attention to sound, Tati and Lynch both really, really value place. I have a quote from Todd McGowan about David Lynch that said, quote, "Architecture is more central to the cinema of David Lynch than that of any other filmmaker." But I'd have to disagree with McGowan on that. I think architecture might be equally or even more central for Tati.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's like that apartment scene that I mentioned earlier. It is so particular in the way that it is set up. Like, you were able to see into these multiple apartments in just one shot, and it's so interesting.
Well, and like David Lynch, Tati was committed to building his precise vision. Monsieur Hulot's apartment building, he added on to an existing building to make it look like that. The Villa Arpels, constructed entirely out of Tati's imagination. And then, famously, he built, quote, Tativille for the set of Playtime.
Right, and according to Jeff Manna on Building Blog, Tativille was conceived by Tati and designed by Eugene Roman. It was strictly a cinema town, born of the needs of the film. Big blocks of dwellings, buildings of steel and glass, offices, tarmac roads, car park, airport, and escalators. About 100 workers labored ceaselessly for 5 months to construct this revolutionary studio with transparent partitions, which extended over 15,000 square meters. And each building was centrally heated by oil. 2 electricity generators guaranteed the maintenance of artificial light on a permanent basis.
During pre-production, Tati visited factories and airports throughout Europe before his cinematographer, Jean Vaudel, came to the conclusion that he needed to build his own skyscraper, which is exactly what he did. The skyscrapers that he constructed were clearly an imitation of the style of Mies van der Rohe, and they were different sizes, and he could just move them all around to create different cityscapes. Anyway, the film was so incredibly complicated and expensive.
And like definitely for both of them, the physical space and setting is really kind of a character itself, or like maybe a force that the human characters must contend with. You know, obviously we've got our classic David Lynch and the recalcitrant object, but sometimes it's a place. And also, you know, like in Twin Peaks, they have to fight against the Black Lodge and other things like that. And there are other directors that do this as well. I think a big one, like I've literally got the coffee table book looking at me right now on my coffee table, is like Wes Anderson for sure is really, really well known for this.
Another filmmaker inspired by Tati.
Yeah, and you can see it. You can see it. And then Bong Joon-ho and Parasite. And I think like that's another one where the house, like the Palmer house, it's like the Parasite house, it's got this like dark energy to it. Like the house itself feels like it kind of has bad energy.
Well, Tati was very focused on mid-century Parisian trends in modernist architecture and interior design. And I wasn't initially sure how David Lynch compared because his aesthetic seems more varied. You know, for example, we have the Palmer House, as you just mentioned. That's a Dutch colonial revival from the 1920s. Then you have the Lost Highway House. That's a very modern style from 1957. So where Tati is sort of uniformly using these very modernist interiors, Lynch is more varied. But I'm reading this great book right now called The Architecture of David Lynch by Richard Martin. And Martin says of Lynch's films, quote, "In particular, it is the legacies of modernist design in post-war America that haunts these films." So there it is. I love that connection to Tati. Martin describes Lynch's cinematic worlds as, quote, "obsessively attentive to the symbolic places and objects, to the investments we make in certain spatial forms. We could just change the name from Tati to Lynch in that sentence, and it would apply completely."
On that note, let's try to guess if this is a description of the world of Lynch or Tati. Highly pressurized environments that operate with their own internal logic. These are meticulously designed yet distinctly fallible worlds, constantly at risk of decay or interruption.
Could be either. But again, that's Richard Martin. That's about David Lynch, but that could be a description of Tati's worlds too. Especially the bit about it being fallible and at risk of decay or interruption. Isn't that so much the comedy of Tati's worlds? There's so much the beauty of these interiors, but the fun is when they start to fall apart.
Well, and both Tati and Lynch were interested in signs that attempt to orient or direct people in the modern world. At least 4 of Tati's films have comical moments where characters have to follow arrows, where they are being misdirected or absurdly directed by the signage. Some favorites are the ones in Mon Oncle, like the arrow that points to the rectangle, which is Arpel's parking spot.
I love that.
Yeah.
Follow your dumb arrow to your rectangle.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, and Richard Martin points out that Lynch's films are littered with signposts that the characters can very deliberately intone addresses and street names as if they hold magical significance. We are repeatedly told exactly where we are. Equally, we often feel without any bearings at all.
I love that quote.
I do too, because I feel like it's so true, like the specific choice of the word magical in particular. Because when we think about Mulholland Drive, it's like spoken as if it's this like magic word or incantation. And I think that that's something that's so interesting about that film.
I love that juxtaposition of we have these very specific places mentioned relentlessly and addresses and street names, and yet we feel lost.
Yeah, and we're lost with them on this journey.
And similarly, in Tati's films, for all the arrows and directions, the characters often seem lost and directionless. And when Monsieur Arpel finally connects with Gerard at the end of Mon Oncle, and finds his joy, he drives against the arrow. It's fun.
All right. So time for chapter 4. We're going to talk about the similarities between the styles of Lynch and Tati. Because Tati uses wide shots and long takes, no close-ups. It kind of erases the director and allows the audience's eye to wander.
In an interview, Tati said this himself about his directorial style. He said, "The dimension of the camera is the dimension of what your eyes see. I don't come close up or make tracking shots to show you what a good director I am. I want your eyes to put you in such a situation where you come to the opening of the restaurant as if you were there that night." He's definitely referring to playtime there.
Well, and as someone who has worked in the service industry and worked a restaurant on its opening night, it honestly felt pretty realistic. I think he nailed it.
But I like the idea that he's not telling us what to look at in a scene by zooming in on something or tracking it. Tati just gives us the whole scene, the whole picture, and we focus on what's interesting to us. We see something kind of similar with Lynch when he'll do these very wide shots. However, my feeling is that a lot of time Lynch's camera feels like a presence, where Tati's feels neutral. Lynch's has a presence.
Yeah, the camera can sometimes feel like its own character, or like it's taking us with it on this journey, like it's some kind of supernatural character, and maybe not always so friendly.
Definitely. I was rewatching some films and parts of Twin Peaks in preparation for this, and even at the very beginning of Straight Story, there's this wide shot of the two front yards, Alvin Straight and his neighbor. But the camera just then kind of like lurks in along the side of the house. It clearly feels like it has a presence. Similarly, in Mulholland Drive, when Betty and Rita are about to enter Club Silencio, it's a very wide shot, but then the camera just rushes toward them suddenly. Again, feels very much like an entity.
Yeah, it's very much its own character.
Well, one scene I think that feels very Jacques Tati from David Lynch in terms of style is the very famous sweeping scene in part 7 of The Return, the sweeping scene at the Roadhouse.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot like a scene in Mon Oncle. Well, actually a couple, because they come back to him a couple times. But there's this street sweeper that, I mean, he's impossible to forget. It's so funny because he just keeps getting distracted. Like, it's so real. Like, he just keeps, like, he'll be starting to sweep and then somebody talks to him and then he gets distracted. He walks away and, forgets what he's doing.
He's the opposite of that American efficiency.
Yes, exactly. He's very much got, like, ADHD or something. It's very relatable.
I think the length of that Roadhouse sweeping scene would have thrilled Tati too. He thought that if you looked at something or someone long enough, it was going to be funny. He said he thought everyone was funny. Here's another quote that I think we can use our Tati or Lynch game with. This says, "The ultimate goal, it seems to me, is to slow us down, and in slowing us down, to revitalize our senses, awaken us to the suggestibility of sound and image, and beyond that, to the power of the silent and of the invisible." Do you think that's Lynch or Tati?
That's hard. It could be either.
That's Tati. But couldn't that be said of the Roadhouse scene?
Oh, definitely.
The Roadhouse sweeping scene.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Well, and Tati trusted the audience to find the subtle humor in his long takes and wide shots. And that leads into another interesting shared hallmark of Lynch and Tati's style. It's about making meaning.
Tati really wanted the audience to participate in making meaning in his films. He famously said of Playtime, quote, "Playtime is nobody," because he meant that Playtime is everybody's film. He said that it was about the viewer's individual experience. So every character in Playtime has the status of an extra, and we, the viewers, get to choose who or what we focus on as we watch. So each viewing of Playtime can be a different experience, which is so interesting. One of the reasons I love the film so much. Tati said, quote, "The second or third time you see Playtime, you start to recognize certain people, and you might watch them kind of follow their interactions then in the scene." Jonathan Rosenbaum called Playtime, quote, "the first really open film."
And Lynch is famously open to viewer interpretation and unwilling to weigh in on theories. There's the quote, "The film is the talking," and the classic, "Elaborate on that." No. He wanted people to take away from things what they wanted to. And I think that's always the really interesting thing with film in general. Like I recently saw The Last Showgirl and I really loved it and I thought it was really moving. And a coworker of mine really didn't enjoy it and just like didn't relate to it all. And it's the thing is that that's the beauty of film, is that everybody is going to be informed by their own experiences. My life experiences are going to lead me to have a very different relationship with a film than my coworker or, a friend of mine or something like that. They're going to come in with their own experiences and histories. And I feel like Lynch was very empathetic enough to understand that was going to be the case. It's going to mean different things to different people.
I like the complete surrender in the sense of both of these directors.
Yeah.
That puts a lot of faith in your audience, that the audience will participate in making meaning from this work. I mean, here we are doing our podcast about David Lynch. I've watched some great films, great television shows that I admired every aspect of, but I stopped thinking about them a couple weeks after I was finished watching because there was nothing left for me to do except appreciate it, admire it, where both Tati and Lynch say, this is yours.
Yeah.
Please engage. Please make meaning of it. This is for you. And if you don't do that, you're going to miss out. You can't be a passive viewer of David Lynch. You can't be a passive viewer of Tati.
Right. I mean, I feel like I hear that a lot with David's work, where it's like when I'm talking to friends or something and being like, oh, I'm a huge David Lynch fan, like people either really engage with it or don't at all. Either they're obsessed or they're like, that's not for me at all.
Well, speaking of audience participation, that leads into another shared comparison between these filmmakers, their love of mystery. And so this is our 5th chapter, mystery.
Yeah, I mean, a hallmark of Tati's style is withholding information. It's a big part of his gags, too. John Fowle said, Tati would rather suggest than show. His gags follow this rule. They never show the thing itself. They unravel themselves in mystery off screen and the silence of our imagination. Each of Tati's gags has a hole in the middle of it and a center of absence, but it's this missing something or radical absence that draws our curiosity and imaginative powers.
Tati does that for comedy, and Lynch does that in his work. And this mystery is what makes Tati's gags so hilarious as well. Jean-Luc Godard has a great quotation about Tati. He says, Jacques Tati has a feeling for comedy because he has a feeling for strangeness.
I feel like that's another quote that could really work for either of them, for Lynch or Tati.
Yeah, it works for both of them. Do you remember that quotation from Truman Capote talking about Perry Smith from In Cold Blood?
Yeah.
He said, it's like we grew up in the same house, he and Perry, but I went out the front door and he went out the back. In some ways, that's like Lynch and Tati. They were like brothers and they went out different doors. Tati toward comedy and Lynch toward surrealism.
Right. But then again, he has those moments of comedy. It's this intrinsic part of his soul, that like earnestness that leans towards the light kind of energy. And that's kind of a shorter chapter, but our next one, we've got quite a bit to say about the dehumanizing force of modern spaces.
Yeah, both Lynch and Tati deal with some very similar themes, and Tati is obviously very focused on this way that modern spaces dehumanize us. A quote from Tati that I love is, quote, geometric lines do not produce likable people. There's a lot of discomfort in his spaces. They're not human friendly. The modern houses and buildings and furniture in Tati's films are uncomfortable and imposing. It's all style over function. They're so uniform, too. It's one thing he really hated about modern life. Tati said, quote, "You don't know anymore if you're in a pharmacy or a grocery store. In the past, everything had a flavor."
I love that. And it's so true. And I think that that really ties in with what we had already talked about earlier, where it's like you and I definitely really prefer these like old classic buildings and things like that over these like very hyper modern, cold buildings and appliances too. Why would you choose the cold modern space over this bright, charming, unique building that's so full of life and history? I'd rather have a crazy winding stairwell than a cold rectangle.
Poor Tati, though, it's probably a good thing he didn't live to see the 21st century, especially here in America, where not only can't you tell if you're in a grocery store or a pharmacy, you can't tell if you're in one state or another because of the corporatization of every store, restaurant, business that we have. It reminds me of one of my favorite Tati gags are those travel posters in Playtime. So they're in the travel agency and all of these exotic destinations are advertised and they all have that identical Tativille building with just a different name. So Hawaii or Mexico. And there's that gray modern building. So good. And so true. So terrifyingly true.
Right. Everything is so uniform and it's so disappointing. And I think that that's one of the things that will draw you in. I think a lot of American people relate to this feeling of we romanticize Europe because it's got all of these old buildings and they've taken the time to maintain them rather than in America where we just knock them down, to save money. And I'm very much of the mindset where I think character over money every day.
Well, with all of our hatred of ugly modern buildings, Jacques Tati's vision gives us some hope because in those spaces, entropy always wins. The rigid order of modernism always falls apart in his films, and then the human spirit emerges. The films are satirical, but sweetly, affectionately so. He just sees the humor in everything, basically. So the end of Playtime is all about re-enchantment and rehumanization.
Right. I mean, that's the thing is it starts off with all of these like cold modern places and settings, but then it ends on such a lighthearted note with the little carousel sort of circle going on. It's making a sweet moment out of a cityscape.
Tati thought playtime really begins after you leave the theater because he thought that playtime could help you see your world with new eyes.
And I think it does. I think that that kind of mindset is also something that we hear a lot from David in interviews. He was very much of that mindset, I think, where it's like, just really try to enjoy your life. Like, look at the world around you and fall in love with the world again.
Well, David Lynch's vision of cities is different from Tati's, of course. Tati's are very clean and modern. Lynch's, especially in Eraserhead, right? It's very postmodern, very, very dehumanizing. So we still have that theme, but it's much more oppressive and dark. So whereas in Tati we're re-enchanted by the end, the re-enchantment offered to Henry is through the Lady in the Radiator. But we don't really have a feeling that that's a space that's compatible with that oppressive city outside of his apartment. It's like he has to exit it and go into this fantasy space.
Right. Well, and it's the same in Lost Highway, right? Like Lynch's house that becomes the Madison house is just really a dark, sinister space that's very uncomfortable. You can sense that Fred and Renee look so physically uncomfortable in that house. I think Lynch very much also plays with that, oppressive house or layer of the house that contains that darkness. He's really a master of it.
Well, in The Elephant Man, he does portray a Victorian city. Aesthetically, that's going to be very different, but it's still a very dehumanizing space. Those crowds chasing John Merrick, that's it, where he has to insist, I'm not an animal. That's extremely dehumanizing as well.
Right.
But also in The Return, we have those kind of modern non-places, to use Marc Augé's term, that Tati also focuses on, especially in playtime and traffic. Tati uses airports, waiting rooms, convention center spaces, and in The Return, there's, for example, the office park. That's not a park, where the statue of the cowboy is. So that's a public place, but you're not allowed to loiter there. You can't relax there. Or the casinos, right? Those are non-places. These decrepit housing developments that are so empty and soulless, the ones outside of Las Vegas. There are these kind of dehumanizing modern spaces throughout Twin Peaks: The Return.
Right. Well, and I think that honestly, those housing plans are kind of the suburban equivalent to the condos that we're talking about in the city, like all these like fancy apartments that are like crazy expensive, but honestly not very good to look at. That's kind of those housing plans out in the suburbs. So I feel like Tati shows a lot of city stuff, like a lot of apartments and things like that. And for Lynch, we're looking at sort of the American equivalent. And especially in this time period, with Tati, we're looking at decades ago, but that modern equivalent is that cookie cutter housing plan, very kind of like Edward Scissorhands. It's very easy to satirize because we look at all these houses and they just look the same, and we kind of hate it.
In the early 21st century, so many of those were built and sold at extremely high prices. And then the 2008 housing market crash happened here, and then you have foreclosures and ghost towns, which is what they're portraying in The Return. Las Vegas had the second highest rate of foreclosures in the country.
Right. And ghost town is such the right word. They have this very haunted quality. I mean, I'm reading the Goldfinch right now, and they talk about it in that too. Like it really has this like menacing quality to it because it's so empty and eerie.
And all sorts of people moved in.
Yes.
And squatted there.
Yes.
Not just the 119 mom.
Right.
Yeah. Well, to go back to the architecture of David Lynch again, Richard Martin's book, he talks about the film Mulholland Drive. And he said that he reads the shots of the grid of downtown Los Angeles' streets as giving the feeling of the workings of an industrial machine. Martin describes it as a place where, quote, the potential for commercial processes to erase all other desires remains present. So even if the shots of downtown LA aren't as crowded as a downtown would be in other cities, Martin sees Lynch's portrayal of that grid as a kind of machine. It's a factory. Los Angeles is a factory where the money we make from films matters more than anything else, matters more than artistry.
Right. And that's something that, again, we've brought up a couple times in this episode, where it's just that was something that Lynch and Tati we went against the grain and refused to play that game of I'm just here to make money. They were like, no, I'm here to show my vision.
I'll bet there are many other ways we could compare these two directors in terms of the dehumanizing city, but we are going to move on to our final chapter, our final area of comparison, and that is character.
Yeah. So while these physical spaces are a character, we also, of course, have the characters, the with the capital T, because, of course, we have Monsieur Hulot, like the main character that comes into play in a lot of Tati's work. And there's something that's very special about an artist who has their own character, their performance self. And Hulot is an everyman. He's not an intentional clown.
He's such a relatable character. The artist Jacques Lagrange, who worked with Tati throughout a lot of his career, he's actually the painter who first sketched the Villa Arpels. He said, "There is no one like the tramp," referring to Charlie Chaplin's character, but there are Hulots everywhere.
Right, and it's true because he's so earnest. Like when he's making these mistakes or missteps and stuff, it's never malicious.
Well, one thing I love about Hulot is that all he wants is to fit in and do the right thing. And I just feel like I can relate to this man so much, Monsieur Hulot. He's just trying to be courteous. He's trying to be polite and helpful. And he always ends up just bringing disorder with him, no matter what. It's never his intention. He is like a bull in the china shop, but he is like a bull who is trying so hard to tiptoe around and break no china.
Right.
But
and then accidentally does.
there it goes.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing with him, right? Is it's like people are just, they'll try to like hand things off to him, or they're like, oh, can you help me with this? And he's like, okay. And then he goes to do it because he just wants to help, and then somehow manages to really just fudge it up real bad.
One of my favorites is at the end of Monsieur Hulot's holiday when he sets off all the fireworks. He's trying so desperately to put them out. You know, this was not an intentional act of mischief. So he finds a hose. The hose, though, connects to a sprinkler. So he's chasing around the spinning sprinkler trying to fill a watering can. It's absurd and so great. Just desperately trying to fix the problem he's created.
Right. Well, it's like that scene we also mentioned earlier in Mon Oncle where he's like, he goes to get this pitcher and glasses and then ends up breaking the glasses. Also, speaking of glasses, there's that scene that I love in Playtime, but this time I'm talking about eyeglasses, where he's like shaking a man's hand, but the man's glasses are in his hand and then he ends up breaking them. Like, it's just like a tiny little gesture that like, there's no reason for that to have gone horribly awry, but of course it did.
Even his car in Monsieur Hulot's holiday, he cannot be an unobtrusive presence. He's just trying to come to the little seaside town like everyone else. And here he comes, you know, clacking and banging and smoking down the street. Wonderful.
Well, and there's also a scene in Monsieur Hulot's holiday that I love where he thinks this guy is being like a peeping Tom on a woman that's changing on the beach in one of those little changing booths, and he like kicks the guy because he thinks that he's like trying to get a look at this naked woman, but the guy is actually taking a picture of his family that happened to be like behind the booth. And then there's this guy nearby, and the guy that's taking the picture is like, what the heck, thinking it's this other guy, you know, kind of starts this like interaction. And the whole time it was just Monsieur Hulot being like, oh my goodness, like what a terrible man, I have to stop him. Like he thinks that he's being helpful, and then it ends up being this whole like debacle.
Well, in Playtime, things really start to fall apart, but also come together because of Hulot's presence. He reaches up to grab a flower from a kind of decorative overhang inside this restaurant, which, of course, was just being built as people were walking into it.
And it's hilarious because like somebody else is trying to reach it and they can't. And he's very tall, which is also part of like the humor too, because he's always just kind of looming. And he's like desperately trying to be invisible, even though he's so tall. And he like reaches up to get this flower. And in the process, he brings down the whole section.
The whole section of the restaurant just falls in tatters. It's like part of the ceiling collapses. And oh boy, here we go. But what's so magical about that moment is that it suddenly energizes and rehumanizes this space, because this restaurant was this very artificial, posh restaurant. Its whole claim to fame is how exclusive it is. But we know it's all fake. The restaurant barely exists.
Yeah, it's like a fever dream.
But all of these wealthy people are very well dressed and making their way in and kind of flaunting their social position. But it's just a theater set. So when Hulot brings down that section of the architecture, all of a sudden a joyful chaos kind of erupts.
Yeah, and like everybody's dancing. There's this American guy and he's like, oh, this is a private section. This is like my club now, my private club. And you can only get in if the back of the chair like was like leaving marks on people's coats. And he's like, you can only get in if you have this like mark on the back of your coat and this crown on the back of your coat. And it's just so ridiculous and fun.
But then it just becomes a satire of that exclusivity, because now the door to this exclusive restaurant and club is wide open. And all kinds of people are just wandering in. There are bohemians playing the guitar. And Barbara, the young American tourist, is playing the piano, and some older French chanteuse is singing her big hit from back in the day. And just suddenly, this very sterile space, thanks to Monsieur Hulot and his clumsiness, has become a lively, real human space again.
Right. And it's something that starts off as like you could tell like as they're setting everything up, it's meant to be very cold. Like all of the coloring in the restaurant is like black and white and it's very stiff. It's meant to be very like posh and classy. You can only come here if you're super rich or something. And then it becomes this thing where like anyone can just waltz right in and everyone's dancing and having fun. It's people from all walks of life.
Then playtime moves to a snack bar, and that's another kind of place that Tati hated. He hated these stand-up snack bars in Paris because, of course, it's the opposite of the old cafe where people would just sit and spend time and relax and chat with neighbors. A stand-up snack bar is all about eat your food and get back to work.
Right, it's like grab it and go rather than like stay, have a coffee, have a chat with your friend, have a nice croissant. It's like, no, get back to making money, get back to your office.
American style.
Yes, American style, honestly.
But instead, in playtime, that snack bar becomes a joyful celebratory space. This crowd just takes over.
Yeah, it's like the after party's over here, guys.
There are examples in other films too, with Hulot's clumsy presence often leading to these sterile spaces becoming more humanized through humor and chaos. And I think we both see a really similar impact of Dougie Jones in The Return.
Right. I mean, even just the way that fans responded to him. Like, I'm totally one of those fans where I will always share a picture of Dougie of like with him with his coffee and be like, that's me. He's so me for real. Like, he is an everyman. We're all just like, you know what, Dougie, you're so real. And we love your earnestness and the way he's always just like shuffling around and like doesn't really know what's going on. And he's not trying to do like harm to anyone. He just has like no idea what's going on. And then chaos just kind of erupts around him.
Yeah, but he ends up doing good, right? Just by being present. Yeah. And it's so much like Hulot. He's not walking into these spaces thinking, I'm going to liven this place up. He's just there. And when we see Dougie, he's in some very kind of soulless or degrading spaces, like the casino.
And then it's like, he's Mr. Jackpot. It's like, hello.
He has that wonderful impact on that old woman, though. And then in the Las Vegas housing development, this sad suburban house where doppelganger Dougie was living with Janie E. and Sonny Jim. Well, once Cooper Dougie is there, it becomes a really warm, loving home.
Right, because like he is allowing the environment to take from him what it needs, kind of, to like add that light back into it.
Even in the office space of Lucky 7 Insurance, when Dougie comes in with the conga line in the Mitchum Brothers, it's this very cold, generic space, and now all of a sudden, Dougie's there. And there's music and he's dancing. It reminds me very much of a Monsieur Hulot influence.
Right. And I think that also a huge part of this, like having a character, like capital letter C character, is also just like the costume, because Monsieur Hulot has this like unmistakable outfit that he's always wearing, and people will recognize. And I feel like Dougie kind of does too. Like, I feel like everyone is always thinking of him in that bright lime green jacket. It's like hard not to think of him in that. And like, it's also like stands out and is bright and awkward in the way that I feel like Monsieur Hulot's outfit is also kind of awkward. Like, he's got this big baggy giant raincoat and like his pipe and his hat and everything. It's like they've got this specific costume, almost like a Halloween costume.
Well, in a lot of fan art that I've found of Monsieur Hulot, it's very abstract, but it's unmistakably him because of the costume, and the same could happen with Dougie.
Oh yeah,
even very abstract, we would recognize that that's Dougie Cooper.
Right.
Well, while we're on the subject of character, we have to talk about Gordon Cole.
Right.
We have the director as a character in Gordon Cole.
That's another example of the director inserting themselves into their own world that they've built. And, obviously with Jacques Tati, when he's playing Monsieur Hulot, he's putting himself into this world that he's creating as his own main character. And so with Gordon Cole, it's like, obviously he's not one of like the main characters per se, but he's still an extremely memorable one. And he's kind of got a look too, he's got his earpiece and everything. And it's funny because he's kind of the exact opposite of Monsieur Hulot, where like instead we've got, almost with Monsieur Hulot, there's like very little talking. It's all these gestures and facial expressions. And with Gordon Cole, we've got him being really, really super loud.
If somebody was to tell me that was a deliberate choice, that Lynch as Gordon Cole was deliberately being the opposite of Monsieur Hulot, it would make sense.
Yeah.
It's perfect. Gordon Cole is always shouting.
Yeah. And, I think we had kind of talked about it too, where it's like, despite his awkwardness, Monsieur Hulot, like, gets attention from women. Like, there are always girls that are interested in him. And obviously, the same can be said for Gordon Cole. Like, Shelley's like, no, yeah, like, there's something about this guy, that I'm into it. Even though they are kind of awkward and silly characters, like, women are definitely drawn to them.
I mean, of course.
Right. And the thing is, like, with that interaction with Shelley, we have the classic, like, girl that makes you want to learn French. And then there's his interaction with the French woman later. So it's like we've got all of this French stuff being brought up around Gordon. So it's like, is that intentional?
Well, the thing that I see as similar with Gordon Cole and Monsieur Hulot in women is they clearly love beautiful women, but it is such a chaste and respectful attention. In Monsieur Hulot's holiday at the costume party, where only Hulot and Martina come to it, she's this beautiful girl who's staying with her aunt nearby. And they're the only ones who come to this costume ball. Everyone else is just sitting in the hotel living room being boring and listening to the news. And these two decide they're going to have some fun. And so they start to dance, and she's wearing a backless dress. And Hulot is very awkward about this. He doesn't want to put his hand on her bare skin, so he puts his fingertips just up on the halter strap of this dress. So while it's clear that he really admires these beautiful women, there's such a respectful interaction with them and a treatment of them that's really touching.
Right. Well, and in Playtime with Barbara, he goes so far out of his way to get her this scarf because he wants to like get her like a parting gift. And then he like gets stuck in the store and she's like already on the bus leaving and he has to have somebody like run the scarf over to her. And it's just so sincere.
I think we see something really similar with Gordon Cole.
Right. I mean, like, that's the thing is, like, Shelley's so drawn to him because, like, as someone who works in the service industry, when you're, like, working at a restaurant or a cafe or something, there's plenty of times where you're going to get, like, like, weird dudes trying to chat you up or something. And you're like, I'm at work. This is awkward and stuff. But sometimes, like, they're just genuinely like nice people, and you can really tell that difference between the vibes. And I think that Shelley can tell from her interactions that like he means well, like he's genuinely an okay guy, and you can see that she's charmed by him. Like nobody really talks to her that way or treats her that way with so much like adoration and respect, and she's like, for the first time probably is like, wait, I'm like so precious to you. Like you see me in this special light. Okay. You know what? I think I'm interested right back.
Well, you brought up the French woman in part 12 of The Return. And I think that's a scene that's confounded a lot of fans and probably still does.
Yeah.
But for me, after watching Tati's films, I feel as though I have a good understanding of that scene. Do you feel like that's a Tati illusion?
I feel like it definitely can be because it's about so much like appreciating the silliness and randomness of life. And I think that there's that deliberate use of French around Gordon. I feel like it's very much Lynch doing a nod.
Well, he's sitting there on this couch with this beautiful woman who's in a very sexy dress. But she's just leaning on him as he's retelling some story about an FBI raid. So it is a very chaste interaction. And then she has to go through this whole elaborate ritual, this silent ritual of getting ready to leave the room. It feels like an Hulot moment or a Jacques Tati miming bit. And Gordon Cole is just enjoying every message of it. But not Albert. Albert's standing there stone-faced, right? Just, I have a message.
Right. And it's like sad because he can't appreciate it and he needs to like open up and just like accept the randomness of the world and be like, okay, we're just like along for this ride.
Well, even after the woman leaves, Gordon Cole tells that corny joke about turnip and she'll turn up later. But Albert still has nothing, no reaction. Later, Gordon Cole says something to the effect of, I really worry about you, Albert.
Yeah.
It's as if you can't open yourself to the fun, to the silliness, to the random human spirit bursting forth, the forces of dehumanization and darkness will destroy you.
Right, like the coldness is going to overtake you, and especially in the universe of Twin Peaks, with all that very tangible darkness that's going on in the world, you have to hold on to the light as much as you can.
It's almost as if Gordon Cole is trying to coach Albert. This is how you'll survive this.
Right.
Have some fun. Bring some Tati into your life.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I could totally see it. Like, speaking of some transplants from Tati into the world of David Lynch, how about those red hoses that we see a couple times?
Absolutely. So we're going to end this with some fun, specific details that we've seen from Lynch films that seem like direct references to Tati, like those red hoses.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very specific image from Mon Oncle. It's a very popular image that people, have seen around.
Yeah, so it's in the Arpels plastic factory. The workers are carrying these absurd long red hoses everywhere.
And we see them in Mulholland Drive. And then we see them again in Wild at Heart.
Right. So first, for the Mulholland Drive scene, it's when the hitman is outside of Pink's hot dog shop, and he's speaking to two associates. There's a woman and another man, and it's the "Have you seen any new girls on the street?" bit. There are people walking behind him carrying these red hoses, just as in Mon Oncle. And as for the Wild at Heart one, we have to thank Ingrid Hoban of the Facebook group that has the most wonderful name. The name of this Facebook group is I'd like to be a part of the Monsieur Hulot universe, even as a cardboard cutout.
Relatable.
So Ingrid Hoban caught the men carrying red hoses in Wild at Heart also. It's a scene right before the Bobby Peru and Lula scene. It's just a view outside a window. It was an amazing catch.
And it's so quick and so subtle. I mean, like, I just rewatched that in the last couple weeks, and I didn't even catch that until you had mentioned it to me, until you sent me a screenshot of that post. Because it's really tucked away. It's like if you aren't necessarily looking for these things, you'll miss it. And that's even like while I've got Tati on the mind, I'm still missing it. Like, it's very sneakily done.
Yeah. Another direct reference that we suspect is in Nadine's Silent Drape Runners and her shop, Run Silent Run Drapes. In Playtime, the characters end up at this big expo where they're advertising modern home products. It's in this soulless modern convention center. Well, there's a business there advertising, quote, "Slam your doors in golden silence." They sell silently slamming doors.
And that whole scene is so funny because the guy that is trying to run this booth is just so over the top and he just keeps slamming these doors, but there's no sound.
He's trying to be angry and emphasize it with a slammed door, but the slamming door that he invented to be silent makes no sound.
Well, and I think it's so on brand for Tati to do something like this because he's so focused on sound. So it's like I can see the thought process of like, All right. Okay. So what if a sound that would normally be, very expected, very, very noticeable and loud and stuff, what if I took it out? What if I just, instead of adding that sound in, because he would do the sound afterwards, it's like, what if I just never add in this sound? And it's so funny.
Well, what's so funny to me about both of these, Nadine's shop and this Slam Your Doors and Golden Silence, is they're both pursuing silence where we don't really think of needing silence.
Right, like no one's asking for this. No one has just been like, what the people really need is silent doors, silent drape runners.
But for some reason, in both, we have these absurd businesses that have solved and commodified superfluous silence.
Right, they're like, I'm going to sell the people what they don't want or need, and I'm going to do it well.
And apparently, because both of them have real businesses, right?
Right.
Nadine seems to be thriving.
Right, in a small town.
Right. In this small town, in a town like Twin Peaks, no one is innocent, but everyone needs silent drape runners.
Well, they need to, so that their neighbors don't know they're spying on them, moving their curtains around, I don't know.
Well, in Eraserhead, there are lots of likely allusions to Jacques Tati. When we see all those steam blasts around Henry when he's approaching the ex's house, it's so much like Hulot and Mon Oncle when he's in the factory. Even the sounds of the steam are very similar. But, of course, it's like Henry is in the darkest timeline version of Monsieur Hulot's world.
Right. I mean, well, because like in Mon Oncle, like that scene itself is pretty bright, like
Yes.
lighting wise and set wise and everything. And it's so different in comparison to the like oppressive industrial nature of Eraserhead.
For sure. But in another rare confirmation from Lynch, the scene where Henry is in the elevator and he's waiting a long time for the doors to close, we talked about that scene in our Lolita episode, but Lynch confirmed that that was inspired by Tati.
Yeah, Jonathan Rosenbaum said, the only time I ever interviewed Lynch was when I conducted a phone interview with him about Eraserhead in 1982. I brought up the possible influence of Tati myself to him because it seemed quite evident to me at the time, in at least a couple of instances, more generally in the use of industrial noise in the background of several scenes, and more specifically in the comic articulation and timing of a moment when Henry, Jack Nance, is waiting inside the elevator in his dingy apartment house for the doors to close, and finally they do slide shut with a dull thud. For whatever it's worth, Lynch confirmed my hypothesis after I cited this elevator scene to him.
He confirmed it.
Yeah, and how about that? We love when there's actual confirmation to our speculation.
Well, I think we've both been rewatching Lynch's films and Twin Peaks with Jacques Tati in mind, and all kinds of little details that connect keep emerging. I noticed things like the straight story starts with 5 little dogs running on an empty street, just like the way Mon Oncle begins. And I assume we're going to continue to spot little details like this throughout our rewatches. And we encourage you, listeners, to do the same. And, oh, please, tell us what you notice.
Yeah, I mean, truly, if you notice any that we haven't mentioned, or you think we might have missed, please message or email us. We would love to know.
So, as we're coming close to the end of this episode, when we were getting ready today and I was looking over the notes one last time, I was thinking about how glad I was that we were focusing on Jacques Tati right now in January of 2025. Because this is a time where it feels like a lot of things are dark. I feel like Jacques Tati is making comedies, and a lot of them are very slapstick and a lot of them are very silly, but there is a kind of unified ideology in his films. It's like that we humans create objects, spaces, and systems that end up dehumanizing us as we try to live with and within them. We create the thing, the building, the infrastructure, the social convention, but then they take on a life of their own. And then the things we create, become entities that enslave us and harm us. That feels really relatable somehow.
Yeah, no, definitely.
But in Tati's world, those dehumanizing entities of our own creation are impermanent. They're fallible. They're just an illusion of control. They're going to fail. And when they do, the best things about being human are going to remain. In Tati's films, there's laughter, there's community, there's love, fun, appreciation for beauty. And even while those dehumanizing forces remain, they're funny. And we're going to laugh at their absurdity and their self-importance. And our laughter is part of how those dehumanizing entities fail. And then we're all going to the cafe, and we're all going to walk in the rain, and we're going to dance. And in a Tati movie, we're left with re-enchantment, with rehumanization and hope. And maybe my greatest fear is the possibility that laughter and love are not enough, but it's nice in this particular moment to spend some time in Monsieur Hulot's universe, even as a cardboard cutout, for a little while, and just imagine that we have this kind of power.
Right. Well, I mean, it's like the light is inevitably what is going to be able to combat the dark. They exist in those opposites for a reason. They balance each other. And I think one good takeaway from this is that I think whenever I'm really sad or I just need like a pick me up, I think I could even just like rewatch the ending scene of Playtime or particular little clips if I don't have time to rewatch the whole thing. And I think that will make me smile. It'll make me laugh and feel like there's hope, especially like at that ending of Playtime, because the whole city's coming together. There's all these different people and there's so much community that forms this like sweet little carousel. And there's like this part where everybody's sort of playing with the windows that are tilting and they're going, woo! And it's just so playful. And you can tell that everyone's having so much fun doing it.
I love how Playtime ends with Barbara finding that lily of the valley, which we don't even see Hulot buy for her. We've seen him get her the scarf, but she opens it and then gets this beautiful little metal lily of the valley. Lily of the valley has all kinds of symbolism in France as a gift of friendship or romance. But Barbara looks up at the street lamps and notices that they're shaped like that flower. It makes me think of that Henri Matisse quote that there are flowers everywhere for anyone who wants to see them.
Right, and I think that's a perfect way of thinking about it because that's what's going to get us through, like trying to scrape a little joy together whenever we can. Like I started keeping a gratitude journal to just try to remind myself at the end of the day. Like if it's a really bad day or something, I can look back and be like, well, actually, okay, so today was really tough, but like at least this one good thing happened. Or actually, a couple really nice things happened. Just because it ended on a sour note because I'm worn out or something doesn't mean that it was actually so terrible. We just have to remind ourselves to, focus on like the little pleasures of life, whether it's like a friend giving me a piece of chocolate or something like that. It can just really turn your day around. Just getting a letter from a friend was a good thing I had the other day. And if we hold on to those little moments, maybe we won't go insane.
Yeah, we won't be like Albert.
Right. Yeah, we have to hold on to that silliness. Laugh at the jokes, Don't just, don't play it cool. Laugh at the jokes. It doesn't matter if you look unprofessional or something.
Enjoy the randomness of life and roll with the punches.
Yeah.
That's not to say that things aren't going to be really difficult.
Right, but we have to do what we can to find those little scraps of joy to keep going.
So as we wrap up this episode, we're very excited to tell you that our next episode will have a special guest.
Yes, in fact, it might be someone that you, as fellow Twin Peaks fans, might know.
We're going to be joining John Bernardi on our next episode to talk about the book Psychic Self-Defense by Dion Fortune. We're stepping just a little bit away from Lynch and more into Twin Peaks with this one because Psychic Self-Defense was a book that Mark Frost used as inspiration for aspects of Twin Peaks.
Yeah, and we're really, really excited to do this one. John has been someone that from the get-go has just been so supportive of us, has been such a great, dear friend, giving us so much advice and just comforting words so often. And so being able to partner is really exciting.
We're Team Rocket and Beware.
That is our group chat, and it's the best. So we hope you'll join us for that. And then in the meantime, please follow us on Instagram at Full Blossom of the Evening. You can also email us at fullblossomoftheeveningpodcast@gmail.com.
And before we sign off, we have to thank Jessica Wallen-Fels for giving us a shout out on her Instagram tribute to David Lynch. We screamed.
I screamed so loud, and then I texted Hilary, and then she screamed. To be approved by your namesake is something that I don't know that we ever really expected. And I think we're still emotionally processing it because it was such an honor. Because really, this podcast wouldn't exist without her and her amazing character of Harriet.
It was so, so nice. Thank you again, Jessica Wallen-Fels, our Harriet Hayward. Well, thank you for listening to the Full Blossom of the Evening.
And we'll sign off, of course, with "It was Laura, and she's come to kiss you goodbye." Goodbye, listeners.
Goodbye.
And I saw her glowing. I saw her smiling. I feel like I'm gonna dream tonight.
Bus.
Bus.